Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about React. We're going to start talking about React. So first off, we're going to look over some examples which are going to explain some of the basic concepts of React, and then we're going to basically write something which is similar to the app we've written last time, but with React. So first things first, our React applications aren't quite what you'd expect in the sense that they're actually code generators. This means that whatever I write in my React application is not what's going to ultimately be seen in the browser. That's because React is actually written in an extension of JavaScript. This is something common amongst all major component-based libraries. React extension is a bit more tame, more moderate, in the sense that it's something called JSX. Now, what JSX does for me is it allows me to intersperse HTML code with JavaScript code. Right, and it saves me from using templated strings and stuff like that. That being said, like I said, my application is a code generator. What's going to get to the browser is going to be relatively light, so the overhead of the library is not that great. However, the development infrastructure is a bit heavier. Uh, Now, the way to go about this is to use a utility called create react app. If we don't use create react app, we're going to have to replicate the development environment ourselves. And what the minimal things we're going to need is something to do transpilation, where transpilation is going to take my JSX code and turn it into regular JavaScript and HTML. And I'm going to need something to do bundling, right? To actually create the files that are going to go to the browser. Now, if I want to do this manually, I'd use Babel for transpilation, which Create React App uses, and I'd use a Webpack for packaging, right? So, which Create React App uses. However, I don't need to worry about that. I can just use this utility. The way to get it is I can just install it. I already have it installed, but I'm going to write it nevertheless. So I can install it globally. In my case, I have to sudo it. And this is going to install it globally, and I can then run it either if I'm in Linux, I'm going to be able to run it just like this, create React app. If I'm in Windows, I'm going to have to run it with npx. Let's create a let's say container app for our examples. So I'm going to do npx create React app and say concept app. Now this is going to take a while, and this reflects the fact that the development infrastructure is relatively heavy. The reason why it's relatively heavy is that I have all these intermediary steps, and it supports stuff like hot reloading. Right? And this means that whenever I save a file, it's going to get reloaded in the browser automatically. So this will basically take a short while. It actually warns me it might take a couple of minutes. Um, I'm going to pause the recording until this finishes. Now, the reason I use React uh, in itself is that whenever my applications get more and more complex, I need a way of managing that complexity. And I have some let's call them tiers of complexity. So if I try to write an app like we did last time with something like handlebars, I'd run into a bunch of things which should be reusable but are hard to reuse. And with something like React, or conversely with something like Vue or Angular, they're just as good as a choice. Well, not just as good, but they're similar in their utility. Um, I can actually extract part of my code as a reusable component. Now this finished, and it actually gave me a little guide here. And the fact that everything is with npm should give me should give me a hint about how my app is organized. It's going to look like the apps, like the servers we've written until now. So I can npm start to start my React app. I can npm run build. This is going to give me the production variant. We can actually easily deliver the production variant. If we have time, we're going to do that. Npm test runs my tests, and this actually gives me, it just ejects. So it makes my app no longer be something created in Create React app, but something independent, but I can't go back from it. So let's just try npm start and then try to investigate what we have here. This is going to open my browser ultimately, and it's going to load my app in a development server, which is a web server of sorts. Now, because this is a separate server, if I want to request some data from one of the servers we've written previously, these requests are going to be cross-origin, so I have to handle that. Now let's load it, and if I look at what was generated, let's try to understand what's happening here. So I have a public directory, and this is going to contain an index.html. Ignore the rest, it's not that important. And what I can see here is that basically this is going to look like what we did last time. We had a div which was a container for our interface, and this is what we have here as well. Right, so I have a div ID root, and this is where my app is going to be rendered. So it's going to be, what's going to happen is that during the lifetime of my app, the contents of this div is going to be replaced with whatever is necessary, whatever components are necessary. And if I inspect this, I can actually look at div and see that it contains a bunch of things, right? It contains a structure, it contains a DOM structure. Now, conversely, I can install something in the browser which is called React Development Tools, and I can see this in its component shape. And my app only has one component, which is called app. Right. So this is how the app is rendered. But what is the app? Well, I can see the app in source here, and what's going to be initially loaded is this index.html. Now, if I'd look at it, it sort of looks like a modern JavaScript file, but it has something strange. The thing which is strange is this part, right, from line 8. And this doesn't look like JavaScript. And this is the JSX I was talking about, right? Because this makes sense. If this was a string, this makes sense. It says draw this string within this DOM element. But this doesn't look like a string, right? This is the JSX, and this is the part that wouldn't run in the browser by default, and which has to be transpiled. This is just a generic index, so my app is actually in app.js. And I notice that my app is a component, and it's what is called a functional component. This is a React component, and there's two ways of writing these React components. So the first way of writing these React components is as classes, and this is the old way of doing it. And the other way of writing these React components is as functions, and this is the new way of doing it and how we're going to do it. If you would like to see the class examples, I can make them available to you because the examples for this course used to be in class form. Now, notice that my function, right, my component function actually returns something, and this is what is actually drawn in the browser. So let's strip this down a bit. We don't care about logos and everything. So let's just say, oh, and notice something else. Notice that I have some in my JSX. I have some attributes, but some of them have different names, right? So instead of saying class, it says class name. Um, let's rip everything off, and we're gonna have this, and I'm going to say I will be the app. And if I save this and I go back to the browser, I notice everything was updated. Right, so this will be my app. Okay, now before we continue, let's look at the build, right? So if I do npm run build, it's going to run an npm script. Where does it get it from? Well, I said that my project is actually organized around this package JSON, and I can see something similar to what I would have seen for one of my servers. It has a bunch of dependencies, some scripts, etc. It also has some additional things. So if I look at this tells me what browsers I'm targeting. Like I said, features on the web are in flux, right? Some of them are implemented, some of them are not implemented. And this tells me what percentage of browsers am I targeting. and I can actually change this so it targets older browsers if I need that. Now my build folder was generated, hopefully, right? And if I look at it, I can see what gets in the actual browser. And for example, my JavaScript code is going to be these chunks, and they look like this. Now that's pretty ugly. The reason is that they're minified, right? They're unintentionally or semi-intentionally obfuscated, in the sense that this actually works somewhat like compression, in the sense that any symbol which is larger is going to be replaced with something shorter in order to minimize the amount of things which are sent over the network. Since this is a web application, this is important because it affects how long the app will take to actually give the user control. Now, not all of them can be replaced, so it's like a partial compression. Right, so let's get back to our app and try to go through some of the concepts which stand behind React. So first things first, I said I have like we looked in the browser and I had a little tree there which got attached under the div with the ID root. Now that tree contained one component, but one way of looking at this, and the one way of looking at any any library which handles user interfaces, is that it actually builds a component tree which is drawn. So a component tree means components can contain other components. So let's make this contain another component, and our first example is going to be something related to state. We'll worry about that later, but let's just say we have a state here, and inside it we have a file called state examples. Now this we're going to start from our app and just make it a generic component for now. So state example. Again, it returns something which is to be rendered, so let's call it I will be the state example. And going back to our app, we're going to use this component. And to use it, we have to import it. And let's say we use it here. So let's make a little header because we're going to have multiple examples. And we're just going to use it similarly to what a custom tag would be. Right? So we just use it here, and it's going to be rendered. If we run the app again, we can just leave the app running from now on, and it's going to auto update. Right, so I will be the state example. Now, what about this state business? Now, the idea with state is that a component is, on the one hand, the component is going to have internal state. Now, this is a bit misleading. So let's investigate a bit what this state business is. So let's assume that we go to state example, and we can have state just by declaring local variables in this function. So let's say we have let counter is 1. And this says the current value of counter is. So first things first, we need to write the current value of counter. How would we do that? We need to have something evaluated. The way to switch basically between HTML and JS, so the way to evaluate something is to use a couple of curly braces. Now, this is going to work perfectly. It's just going to say 1. The problem I'm going to have is what happens if I change counter through some mechanism of some sort. Well, what happens is that the component is not going to know about it, so it's not going to get updated. I'm not going to get the new value of counter. So what I need is not just state, but rather managed state. Now, managed state means that I have some state which has the characteristic that if I change it, it's automatically going to cause the component to re-render if it needs to. Now, to do this, we're going to use something which is called the hook. Now, hooks are regular functions which basically encapsulate behavior which is common between components. Now, React does, we can make our own custom hooks, though maybe not today. But React does come with some important and predefined hooks. And one of them is the hook which gives me manage state, which is called use state. Now I can get it from React, so we're going to say import use state from React. And instead of saying let counter 1, we're going to say it's constant, but it doesn't matter. So we're going to have a getter and a setter, which is we're going to get from use state of initial value. Let's say it's 1. So now, if I change the counter with set counter instead of directly, the component is going to know it has been changed, and it's going to redraw itself, re-render. Right. So let's set this up. Let's assume we have another div here containing a button. There's a bug here, but we're going to fix it shortly. So let's say we have a input type button. Value is plus. On click is something. Now, on click, notice that on click looks a bit different from what I'd have if I did this in just plain HTML and JavaScript, in the sense that it's camel cased. And what I'm going to give on click is going to be a function. We're going to say handle click. Now this function doesn't exist, so let's assume handle click is just a function which is a handler which we've declared here. Before we go on though, notice that Visual Studio Code is nice enough to signal something to me, which is basically each of the components returns a subtree which has to be attached somewhere in the DOM. And since it's a subtree, it has one root. And this doesn't have one root, right? It has two things here. So I have to return one root, so I can basically put them in a div. And this is going to work out. However, something to take into account is that I've put a div here just to organize my component. And this div might affect stuff like styling, right? It's going to affect selectors and so forth. So I might want to not use an actual div, but to use something which is called the pseudo root. So just a fake tag, which is going to look like this. And now I can have two things and still have one root basically. Now in handle click, we're just going to update the counter. So I'm going to say set counter of counter plus 1. And if we go back to our app, we're going to notice that whenever we press the button, the component redraws itself. So this is state within a component. Now, if I'd have just state within a component, the usefulness of this would be relatively limited. So I have to have some sort of communication between components, right? Because if I'd have state just within a component, this component would get larger and larger until ultimately it would be unmaintainable. The whole idea of components is that I can separate logic in different, let's say, code bundles. So let's see how props work. Well, props are a way for a parent component to send something to the child component. So we're gonna make a new folder which is going to be called props. And we're gonna have a couple of files, so props parent and props child. Now, starting from app, let's have another heading here, which is going to say props. And let's import it from the relevant file. Obviously, there's nothing in props parent, so let's build it. So we're going to say function props parent. And for now, whenever we've written one of these functions, they had no parameters. But actually, any component can have a parameter which is called props. Think about it like this. We're defining our custom tags basically, and we can define custom attributes on them. And the attributes are going to be what I'm going to get into props. Let's assume that parent from some source actually has some data. And I'm just going to copy paste something here. It's a it's a list of things, a list of items with descriptions. Right. Now, if these are simple, I want to draw them in the document. So if these are simple, I can just do this. So I'm gonna say, let's say this is a div, and what I want to do, I want to generate something for each of the data items, for each of the elements in data. So I can go to JavaScript by using the curly braces, and I can say data.map, and with each element I'm going to draw, let's say, a div. And this is going to be, we're back in HTML, so we have to go back to JavaScript and say e.description. This is going to give me a warning because whenever React handles lists, it needs for each element to have a unique ID, and they don't. And we're going to transmit this for React through an attribute called key, which is predefined. So we're going to say e.id. And this is going to work out fine. We forgot to export it. And this is going to work out fine. It's great. However, let's say that this part gets more and more complex. There's behavior attached, etc. So it would be useful for us to extract it in a different component. So let's say instead of this, we're going to have props child. And now for each of the items, we have a props child component. We obviously need our key because React likes keys for its little lists. But we're also going to need something else. How is the child going to know which of the items it's handling? Well, we're going to invent an attribute. Let's call it item. And this is going to be just E. So now going to props child. Props child is also going to be a function. Let's just start from this one. And it's going to be a function of props. Now props is an object and I can destructure it, right? I know what it contains. It contains all of these attributes that I've sent forward to my child. So I can say something like const item is props. So now I have item. So let's say each child is actually a little div. And it's going to say I have ID item.id and content item.description. Right, let's do that. We forgot to import props child. Bad reload, but it actually works. Right, so this is great. What happens, however, because I said we don't know where the data came from, right, this data. What happens if it changes? Right, if I have to update one of my children in some fashion. Well, let's see that, and let's see another hook we have at our disposal, which is called use effect. So if I want to update something in the child, let's first go through our example. What we want to do is we have this mock service here, which gives us a list of something blog posts, And if I go to an ID, I get a different blog post, the blog post with that particular ID. So what I want to do is in the parent, I want to select the ID, and when the ID changes, the child is supposed to do an HTTP, to make an HTTP request and then load this post description. So let's try that out and see what's going to happen. So we're gonna have update, and we're gonna have a parent update parent JS and an update child JS. Right. So starting from our let's get a parent. Let's get the state example and use it for the update parent. And we don't need our counter, but what we do need is the ID we're supposed to select. So let's say we have ID and set ID. And we should have a valid value, and the first valid value is 1, so that's fine. We're gonna need this, and here we're going to need a couple of things. So we have to select the ID, and we're going to select it through an input. Now we have to update the ID in our state whenever something happens. So we could use onChange, but onChange is going to get called on each key press, which means we're going to make some redundant requests because we have an ID which is 13. So let's just say we're going to update the ID in our state whenever this text input loses focus. This is called onBlur. I'm going to say handle blur as set ID. Right, and what are we going to set the ID to? Well, we can get so this is an event handler, so it has an event. Any event has a target, and since our target, in our case, is a text input, it's going to have a value. Right, so that handles it. Now we need our child, so let's say it's another div, and it's going to be update child, and it's supposed to handle something relating to this ID. So we're going to say item is ID. We didn't import it, so let's import it. And now let's go to the child. So what the child is supposed to do in our example, it's supposed to make an HTTP request and then show the result to a certain extent. So we need to have our item, and we're gonna get it from the props. And since we're going to show the result, we should probably keep the result somewhere. So the result is going to be this content bed, and the default value of this is going to be an empty object, because what we're going to get from the mock service is an object. As for what it renders, what it draws in the browser, I'm gonna say for item ID. Sorry, so we're gonna return a div, let's say, and we're gonna say for item.id content is content dot title. Right, so this handles the displaying part, but what it does not handle is actually getting the data from the server. So when would we get the data from the server? Well, probably one way of putting this is when I first draw this component, I'd like to make an HTTP request. Let's first write the make an HTTP request part. And this is not a great idea, but let's just use some tags which are going to show us the results better. Typically, I wouldn't use these tags. What I would use is classes, but for now, let's just leave it like this because these are tags which have presentation elements in them. So I'd like to avoid them. So for now, if I go here, I don't think we loaded it. Let's put it here. So we're gonna have h3 update. Right. For there's nothing there, right? There's no nothing. Uh, update part. So no, this is the item is just it doesn't have an ID, it's just item. So we're gonna see for one content is and nothing happened. And I can change this, and that's fine, but still nothing happened. Now, what I would like to have happen is to make an HTTP request, and we're going to write a call it a naive function in the sense that it's not going to check any errors, and it's going to assume everything is fine. But it's going to be a function of some ID, which is going to make an HTTP request. This is going to be done with fetch. And let's just take the address from here. So our request is going to be to whatever post as required. Now this can actually give us a 404. We're going to ignore this for this example. We're going to say we received our data, so it's await response.json. And then set content of data. But still nothing's going to happen because this is not called. What we'd like to have happen, like I said, is when the component is drawn, we'd like to make this request. The way to do this is something which is called an effect. So we're going to do use effect. And the way use effect works is I have some function which is going to be called under some conditions. Right, so this is the function, and this is an array of dependencies. If I leave this array empty, this function is going to be, the function within the effect is going to be called once, whenever the component is first drawn. However, I can write a dependency here, such as item, and whenever item changes, the effect is going to be called again. Now, what an effect does is not really all that complicated in the sense that it just runs some JavaScript code whenever something changes. Now, if I have multiple effects, they are run in the order in which they appear here. So let's leave it with just one thing, right? And then we're going to populate the dependencies. So when the effect is triggered, we're going to say get post of item. And this is going to make the request, and after everything has set finish processing, is going to set the content, which is going to trigger the component to redraw itself. Right, so for one, content is this. But if I change to two, the ID changes, but not the content. So what I'd like to have happen is to have whenever the item changes, to do the request again. And this is going to work. Right, so these are effects. Now, I've seen that I can basically send data from the parent to the children. And when in the children, I can trigger some JavaScript code whenever one of my properties changes, basically. Now, what about the other way around? Uh, I could easily imagine situations in which I'd need to communicate with my parent, right? So, or I'd need to communicate with somebody my parent knows. What happens if I have to have coordination between children, for example? Or what happens if I have to modify my parent state? Now, this idea is called lifting state. And we're going to see how this is done. So if the parent wishes for the child to be able to notify it or to change its state, it has to send it a way of doing so. Right? The child doesn't, by default, the child has no means of doing this. But the parent can empower the child by giving it basically a function. And the child is going to call that function whenever it needs to change the parent state. So let's have a folder called lifting here. And it's going to contain a lifting parent and a lifting child. Let's not forget to put them in app. And now let's get back to our lifting parent. Now our lifting parent is going to contain some data. Just it's the same data that we had in props parent. This data, only this time it's going to be managed instead of unmanaged. So let's close everything else. So instead of doing what we've done here, so let's call it lifting parent. We don't care about this for now. We're gonna say const data set data is going to be use state of this thing. So now we want to show a couple of things. So we're going to need two divs here. One of them showing the state of the parent directly, and one of them passing it to the lifting child. So showing the state directly, we're gonna say h3 state in parent. And this is trivial. You're just gonna say data.map div and we're just gonna say e.description. Additionally, we're going to send each of the items to the child. So again, data.map, but this time it's going to be lifting child key e.id, and let's say item easy. And let's just leave it at like this for now. Let's go to the lifting child. Only in this case, the child is going to, instead of having just showing things, it's going to theoretically be able to edit things. Right? So for item ID description in child is, and this is going to be an input type text. Um, and we have to hold this, if we want to edit it, we have to hold this description somewhere. So we're going to say const description, set description is use state, and we're going to start from what we got from our parent. So we're going to say use state of item.description. This means that this input text is going to have a value, which is going to be description. And whenever I change it, it's going to change the value in the state with set description. And we're just going to write it in line for now. So I'm going to say on change, this is going to be a handler of event. And I can write the handlers in line unless they're complicated. In this case, it's not really all that complicated. It's just going to do set description of event.target.value. Right, and at some point, after I've changed the value in my state, I want to send it to the parent. So I'm going to have an input type button. And something has to happen on click. And we're going to say on click is handle click. We can easily write this function, but we're not going to, its prototype, but we're not going to know what to do. How are we supposed to update our parent, right? Well, I can go back to the parent and I can send something else to the child. So let's assume that the parent sends something to the child and it's going to say on parent update is update parent. Right, well, this is a function. And how can I update the description of something? Well, I need the ID and the description. And here we're going to say to do perform update. Now the child doesn't know what this function actually does. It just knows that when it's supposed to update something in the state of the parent, it's supposed to call it. So in the child, we're just going to say update parent. We're just going to say we have this parent update on parent update. This is what we call it, I guess, right? And whenever that is clicked, it's going to do on parent update of item.id and the current state of the description from its state. So the child is done. Now the child has done its job, even if the parent doesn't actually have the logic. It's doing everything it has to do. Now back in the parent has to actually update the state. We're gonna say modified state, modified data. Sorry, is data. If I want the component to know it's supposed to redraw, I can only modify this with set data. But it's actually an array, which is why I've copied it here. So I'm going to say const index. What am I supposed to update is modify data.find index. Where e.id is the ID I've received. Modify data of index. We're assuming that nothing can go wrong, which is generally not a good idea. Dot description is description. And now I'm supposed to do set data of modified data. Unfortunately, this is not going to work out because it's not going to do deep compare. Now, if I want to force this update, I can actually make a copy of modified data using the spread operator. Now it's a different thing, and it's going to get updated. Now let's see how this works. Now if I do test 123 here and I do update, I can see that I've managed to lift the state from the child to the parent. Right, so these are some minimal fundamental concepts we wanted to go through. We'll go back to stuff as needed. What we'd like to do now is to write a simple application which puts these to use in an actual, functional context. Now there's by comparison to what we did last time, there's going to be a couple of things missing, or in the grand scheme of things. The first thing that's going to be missing is going to be routing, because we're going to see next time that we can do this routing with React Router, and we're not going to use this for now. The second thing is that we're going to handle state management, right? So the first thing I want when I have a complex application, the first complexity challenge I'm going to run into is this functionality reuse challenge, right? I want to reuse stuff which I can reuse. The second one is going to be the fact that I have to manage the state of the application. Now there's various levels of complexity to this. So last time we just kept some global variables. Now this, if I have a really simple application, might be okay. But typically keeping global state just in global variables is going to cause me a lot of problems when the application gets more complex. What we're going to do in our example is we're going to do something relatively simple in which we're going to keep some data stores. Now this again, for let's say a moderate complexity application might be all right. But for a large application, that's not going to be all right, and we need a specialized state management mechanism, which we're not going to see today, but is going to be done with Redux. Now, why would I need this? Let's look a bit at this particular example and let's inspect it again. So if I inspect it and go to components, I can see I'm starting to get a state tree, right? A component tree, sorry. So what happens if I want to pass something from props child, for example, from the third props child to lifting child? Well, I could just the only way I've seen until now is I could just lift the state, right, from props child to props parent. But props parent doesn't know about lifting child 3. So it has to lift the state to app, and then app has to pass it to lifting parent, and then to 3. Now, the larger my component depth, the more complicated and the more coupled this will become, because everybody has to be aware of what I'm passing. So by default, this is not something extremely flexible. I need something to manage state. Right? I need something to allow me to get some state from props child and make it available to props child 3, and make it up there available to lifting child 3 without having to pass through the whole tree. Like I said, we're going to have a minimal solution, which is basically custom state stores, and we're going to see a more complete one next time. So that being said, let's create another folder here. We're going to call it simple app. Now our simple app is going to have a server, which is going to be the same server we used last time, and it's going to have a front end, which is going to be the React part. Let's start building that one because it's going to take a while, just like last time. And we're going to leave it running. As for the server, now the server is going to have a server.js and a package.json. I'm just going to copy paste them here and explain whatever is a bit more interesting. So the server is going to be what we've seen last time. It's the books and chapter server. Something to note is that I need cores, right? So if I'm going to make requests from localhost on port 3000 to localhost on port 8080, these are different origins. And if I don't have cores, I'm going to get errors, right? It's not going to load. Now my dependencies are going to reflect this, but again, they're not really all that complicated. So they're coarse express equalized in SQLite 3. So let's install our dependencies as well. And we can run our server and create our tables. While this happens, I'm just going to pause the recording and take any questions you might have about the first part. Right, so everything installed, so we have to do a couple of things. So the first thing is we're going to start our server and leave it running. And we should make our initial request and nuke our data. So we're just going to say localhost sync. Let's create our tables. And here in the other part, we could just run the application. But first, before running it, let's do a couple of things. So let's go to the server. We're just going to ignore from now on. It's the same server. It works in the same fashion. So let's just delete everything we don't need. And what we actually need is just index.js and app.js. Of course, there's a couple of imports here, so we're going to have to take them out because we've deleted their files. And as for app, we're going to leave it in its minimal state. So it's just going to be a div, which is going to tell us it's going to be the app. For now, it's lying, but we're going to fix this shortly. Right. So now, how will our app look like? So we don't have routing, so our app is going to be a component tree. Now, what we're going to have in the app itself is going to be a book list. Right. So let's create book list. It doesn't exist yet, but it's going to be in a file just right here. So let's create the book list. So in order to abandon app, so we're going to basically abandon app. So in book list, we're going to write something similar. So it's going to say I will be the book list. Right. So this worked out. Now, how will the book list look like? Well, it needs to hold a list of books, right? Which means I'm going to have a books set books is use state, and since it's a list of things, it's going to start from an empty array because we probably were going to want to iterate through it. Now, at least in its let's say starting state, I can have a little header here. And then I can show something for each book. So I'm going to say books.map, and at least initially, we're just going to write a div with the title. Well, does this work? Well, maybe, because we don't get the books from anywhere, and even if we did, we wouldn't have any books. We need to add them. Now, we need to get the books from the server, whatever the list of books contains. And let's say we want this set of operations which involve the server to be in a separate module. And let's call that module bookstore. Now we need something else. Like I said, we want to have a primitive mechanism of state management. And the way this is going to function is I'm going to have some stores like this one, which are going to contain some data. And anybody can register to a store to be notified when the data changes. Now, if I talk about notification mechanisms, I might think about events. And this is we're going to use something similar. Now, events themselves are something which is relatively heavy, right? So they're objects with a bunch of default properties and inside them depending on the event. Now, if I think about something which looks sort of like events but is a lot simpler, right? The simplest event I could define would be an event which is just a string, right? It just notifies me that something has happened, something particular, but not of the details of that something. And then the responsibility of getting the details is on me. So we're going to use such a mechanism, a simplified event mechanism, which is called FB emitter, for Facebook emitter. We could actually write something like this ourselves, but it's not really worth it. Right, so given this FB emitter, let's think about how the store is going to work. Well, the store is just going to be it's going to know the server because it gets stuff from the server. Now, in a larger application, we maybe want to move such information in a separate config module, but this is not large enough. So, and it's going to be a plain JavaScript object in the store, in which I have a data array. What kind of data does the store contain? And an emitter. Now, the emitter we're going to import from FB emitter. And the assumption is that we can share the store between various things. Now, to share the store, before we complete the thing, we're gonna say const store is new bookstore, and this is what our module is going to export. Now, this is fine, but our store does nothing. So the first thing we're going to need is a method to get all the books. Then we need something to add a book. Save book, which is going to be update, and delete book. Now get books has no parameters. Add book receives a book. Save book receives an ID and a book. And delete book receives an ID. So let's write them. So all of them are going to involve using fetch. This time we're not going to be that optimistic about fetch. We know that fetch has let's say, behavior which is stranger than other libraries, in the sense that if I have a transfer error, so an error which relates to the network, I'm going to get an exception. That's fine. In terms of promises, what an exception is going to translate to is I'm going to get a promise rejection. However, if the server does reply to me, but it replies with an error code, such as 400 something or 500 something, this is not going to be an error from fetch's perspective. So we're going to handle this. And we're going to say this. We're going to say response await fetch server slash box. Now the response might be okay or not, so if not response okay, throw response. If it is okay, we're gonna say this.data is await response.json. The data is going to be JSON because it's one of our servers and everything is like that. So after I've populated the data, what I have to do is notify whoever's interested that I have new data. So we're going to say this emitter emit get books success. Now if I have an error, I'm going to be courteous and write it to the console. But then I'm going to emit something which says get books error. Now this in our case, we're not going to handle this, but we can handle it, right? Typically, we'd show some sort of error to the user as well. But for now, we're not going to trouble ourselves with that. Now, what about that book? Well, it's going to be similar. Let's write that book. Let's start from this one. So it's going to be a fetch two books. However, it's going to have a couple more things. The default method is get, so this in this case method post. We're going to explicitly give it the header, which is content type. And then the body, which is going to be JSON stringify of whatever book we received. Again, this might go okay or not. There's no data which is interesting to us. And we're not going to emit anything. We're just going to say this.get books. That's because, and this is going to be add book error. That's because we don't want to become too disconnected from the server state. Now, like I said, web applications are useful because when they have multiple users, and somebody else might have added another book. So I can't assume what's on the server. What about save book? Well, it's going to be almost identical to this one. The difference is going to be that we're not going to slash box, but rather to slash box slash ID. And we're going to do a put. Otherwise, it's similar to this one. What about delete? Well, delete is going to be similar to this one, with the difference that I'm not going to have any relevant request body, which means this stuff disappears. And the method is delete, and of course, delete book error. Right, so this is our store, and we're going to abandon it. This is all we're going to write in it, if we didn't miss anything. So let's get back to our book list. Now, we'd like to, whenever the book list is loaded, we'd like to make a request to the server and get the initial list of books. So what we need is an effect. This effect is going to be run only once. It's a run once effect. And we saw that the run once effect has an empty list of dependencies, right? These are called effect dependencies, and they're what triggers the effect. But it is going to be triggered once whenever this is first rendered, this is first drawn in the browser. So I'm going to say we need our store. So I'm going to say store getBooks. Unfortunately, this is an operation which takes some time. We don't know how much time. And we don't know when it succeeds, right? We could actually, if we didn't want to complicate our existence, we could actually just treat the promise. But we're not going to do that because we're using the event emitter. So we're going to say store dot emitter add listener. Now my events are just strings, like I said. My pseudo events are just strings. And they're handled by functions which can't have any parameters, right? Because there's no further description of the event. So whenever this successfully completes, we're going to say set books of store.data. And although it's invisible, this actually works. Let's look in the network so we can actually see that it happened. Right, so we got the books. Only it's an empty list of books, so nothing is shown. Right, so in order to have this, let's say, functioning end to end, what we're missing is a form to add a book. So let's create such a component. We're gonna call it add book form. And after we've implemented it, we're going to need it here. And let's say we have an h3 add a book, and here we have add book form, whatever that does. We can go to add book form and write a, let's call it a minimal add book form. So function add book form of props, and for now it's just going to tell us it will be the form. Right, so this seems fine. So let's get back to so let's try to fill in the form, right? So in order to add a book, I'm going to need something form-like, which is going to allow me to populate a title and the content, right? So I'm going to say const title set title. It's going to be use state. This is an add form, which means it doesn't have anything in its initial. We don't start from anything. We start from a default value, which in the case of strings is going to be an empty string. Now we're also going to need to have the logic to populate these. So we're going to need something which sort of looks like a form. It needn't be a form. It can be a div like this. So let's just say we have a couple of divs which contain a couple of input text. Now, in order to not use labels, we're just going to put placeholder title. There's no advantage in not using labels. We're just writing the simplest thing possible. And this has a value and an on change. So whenever this changes, we're going to say set title of event target value. Similarly, we're going to have something for content. And we want a button. Right, that's fine. But what's going to happen when we click the button? Well, we can delay the answer to this question by saying it's something called add. which is a function we've defined here. Right, it's a function of event. But now, when we have to click add, we notice that we don't actually have the enough information. So what we can do is we can rely on the parent to send us something which will allow us to add a book. So let's say on add, whenever we need to add something, we're going to use something which was sent through the props. And thus, assuming everything is correctly written, this is going to allow us to send on add of some book. So title, content. Right, so all that's missing is for the parent to send us this function. So let's go to book list. So we need to send something in on add, and let's call it add book. And we can define this here because we do have access to the store. So add book is going to be something of book, or function of book, which is going to say store dot add book of book. So let's see if this works. Sort of, we just showed the title, so it works exactly as we've written it. But that's the first step. Now, let's say we want the books to be, we want to be able to delete the books, to edit the books, etc. Probably this kind of functionality is going to be heavier than we want to just write here. So let's assume that we have a component called book. Now we know this needs a key, and we know probably it's going to need the item it's handling. Let's preemptively import it. And let's create the file. And in its simplest shape, it's going to be item is props. So here we can write something like div I have the title item.title and content item.content. Now it's here, but it's not really visible. Let's make it a bit more visible. Let's make these two a bit more visible. But instead of doing what we did last time, as in let's use on one for one of them, let's use inline styles, and for one of them, let's use a class. So this one is going to be the class one. We need a little span here. And we saw that some attributes have different names. So this is class name. And let's call it book title. Now this is supposed to come from a CSS. So let's assume we have a book.css in which you say that book title has background color light blue. Now to connect this to book, I can notice that apart from importing JavaScript modules, I can also import something else. So I can import resources. I'm going to make the file available here. Right, so now it's a bit more visible. What about content? Well, it's going to also be a span, but this time we want to use an inline style. Now, as an aside, I'm not supposed to use inline styles for this. I'm not supposed to use inline styles to compensate for the fact that I've not written my CSS correctly. But inline styles are really, really useful when my components are dynamically generated. Let's imagine that I have an interface which has a bunch of circles, which are indicators of sorts. And depending on the value of the indicator, they get greener or redder, right? So if the indicator is critical, it's going to be red, and if the indicator is in a safe state, it's going to be green. And let's say these are generated automatically. How would I style them, right? I would style them by populating this property, and since we're in JSX, this is going to contain an object, and in this case, it's going to be background color. I have the same properties, but they're written camel case, light green. Right, so now it's a bit more visible. Now I have a couple of operations, but I also need edit and delete. So let's start from the top. Now I can assume that if I need edit and delete, I'm not going to access the store directly, but rather I'm going to be passed edit and delete from my parent, from the book list, just like we did for Redbook. So the book list, we can assume that it's going to need a save book, which is going to be something of IDM book, which is just going to forward to the store. And it's going to need a delete book, which is just going to be something of an ID, which again, it's going to forward to the store. Now, since these refer to something with an ID, I can't actually do them myself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give it to somebody who handles entities based on an ID, which is the book. I'm going to say, whenever you need save, call this. And whenever you need delete, call this. Now, from my perspective, I've done everything that is needed, right, from the book list perspective. What's left is to make the book actually do use them. Right? So for delete, things are relatively simple. I'm going to say input type delete, type button, value delete, on click, and I can elect to do it in line or just take it out in a separate function. Let's say delete book. Which is an event handler. And here we're gonna say we need to call the on delete we got from the parent, so we can destructure it here. It's gonna say on delete of item.id because we can only delete one thing. We only know about one item. We handle one item. Right, so let's add another book. And this time let's delete it. And it seems to be working. Now what about editing a book? Well, if we think about editing a book, one way we might think about it, since we don't plan to insert routing, is to consider that this book component is actually has conditional rendering, right? So there's a condition based on which this component is going to look one way or another way. So what we want to implement here is editable rows. Right? So I can click something to make a row become editable. How would I do that? Well, I have to have the toggle, so to speak. So we're gonna have is editing and set is editing, which is going to do use state of, let's say the default is false. Oh, right, false. Right, so this, what we've seen until now, is a view mode, and the other one is an editing mode. So the conditional rendering logic is going to look something like this. So we're going to say, let's say we have a large div, and here we're going to say something like pass to JavaScript. So if it's editing, then something, otherwise something else. Now we don't yet know what's supposed to happen when it's editing. So let's just put a fake root here and say I will be the editing variant. But we do know what's supposed to happen when we're not editing. When we're just viewing the record, we can delete it, and that's it. It's what we've already written. Right, so this is fine. It's actually working. However, we can never go to the editing mode. So we need something to switch from view to edit and from edit to view. Now we could do this in line, but let's create just a couple of functions. So we're gonna say let's call it edit, and this is going to set editing true, and cancel, and this is going to set editing to false. And these are going to have a couple of buttons. So one button here, and a corresponding button here, which is going to say cancel. Right, so now, well, it doesn't say cancel, but it does what we expect it to do. This is going to be cancel. Now, what about the actual content of the editing part? Well, it's going to be really similar to what we had in add form. Uh, in the sense that we forgot something in that form, by the way. We forgot to reset these, right, to empty them. So this is going to be what I'm going to have in one book is, since I'm going to be able to edit, it is going to be similar to what I had in add form. So I'm going to need to keep a title and a content. Only I don't start from an empty state, right? I start from what was there previously. So item.title and item.content. As for the inputs, let's just start from this one. And we're going to replace those two spans with some inputs. Since it doesn't matter if we use enters here, let's just do that so we just see it better. Right. So we can just go to add book form, and we're going to take the input for title and use it here and see what's different. Well, value title, that's fine. On change, that's fine. I think everything's fine. The placeholder doesn't really matter because typically there's going to be something there. And the same thing for content. Right, and we need a save button. Well, the save button is going to say save and save book. We don't yet have save book, so let's write it. Again, this is an event handler, but we're just going to ignore the event. We're going to say on save of item.id and something book-like, so title and content. And if we want to give the user some immediate feedback that something happened, we're going to we can leave his editing mode, right? It's when you press save, it takes you back to view. So let's see if this works. Okay, edit. Not really. Why doesn't it work? Let's see. There seems to be something wrong with the request. It says accepted, but it didn't get changed. Let's look at it and see. That should be fine. Maybe we didn't send what was supposed to be sent here. Let's see. And yes, we did not send anything in the request. Why didn't we send anything in the request? Let's see. So save book. Right, on save of item ID and title content, that's fine. Save book. We forgot to put book here. And now it should work. Right, and indeed it does. Right, so this is going to be about it for today. I'm going to stop the recording and take additional questions you might have.